Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of What's on Your Mind. I'm your host, Nimade Bewu, or That African Butterfly, as I'm known on social media. I'm so excited about my guest today. Now, it's officially June, so it is Pride Month. I love Pride Month because I'm obsessed with rainbows. They just make me happy. I love them everywhere. And so for Pride Month, we're especially going to be focusing around mental health still, but topics around sexuality and gender identity, things like that. And to kick things off, I have with me Reverend Brooke Scott. She is a cisgendered, queer ordained minister who is the pastor of Church on Main and the organizing pastor in Wilmington, Delaware for Newcastle's Presbytery. She's also a social worker with a dual degree in the divinity with a Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School and a Master of Social Work from the University of North Carolina. Thank you so much for joining me, Reverend Brooke.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
I'm excited to chat. Is there anything that I left out of your intro that you would like to share everybody with a little bit about you?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
to start off, can you share with us a little bit about your journey of navigating? Because I think, first of all, sexual identity and religion, we instantly think of and know that there's so much negativity towards it, being anything outside of straight, cisgendered. So to not only be open about being queer, but to also be a pastor is, I think, surprising for people and awesome. But can you share a little bit about your journey of navigating your sexuality in context with your religious beliefs?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up kind of unchurched for a little bit, but the church is a big part of my extended family, so it was always kind of around me. Even though my own parents were very skeptical about organized religion. And I always joke and I say that they were a little bit ahead of their time. They were like, even though we grew up in the church, we don't necessarily want to raise our daughter in it. So my parents were very open-minded, taught me, just accepting everybody, taught me values of equality. Um, and at the same time, I always felt a connection to spirituality, God, church. The little bit I knew about the church always just really fascinated me. But because I wasn't really required to go, it became my rebellion to ask them to take me. And so I got really connected with my youth group. And it was great. It really helped me kind of answer some of my questions, learn about the Bible. But a lot of those first experiences with church were with pretty conservative churches. And so it was like very jarring for my parents because they were like, what's happening? Like, we didn't teach you this stuff. We're like kind of okay that you're like finding an interest, but like are a little bit worried about you. So but I mean, as it goes, like I was in spaces that gave me community, but at the same time sort of put a lot of really harmful, oppressive ideas in my head. And it took me sort of doing my own study to find Christians who identified as queer for me to realize, like, not only was I queer too, but also um, I saw it be okay. And so it took me a while to sort of find my way in college and seminary, where then most of the people I knew were queer and also had resources about queer theology and how to interpret the Bible in new ways and help me understand like why people were interpreting it the way they were and why we didn't have to. So it's been a long journey, but um, I'm happy to be an example of not having to give up any part of yourself. Like there are Christians out here that um, are able to live into their sexuality freely. So yeah.
And I think that it's so great that you are an example of that. I grew up very religious too, like church every Sunday and Wednesday, Saturdays. I felt like I practically lived at church, but it was also in like a conservative space. So my initial views of what Christianity were very limited.
Yeah.
And so I think it's wonderful that you were able to find a wider range and then also be that wider range, because it can feel like, oh, if I don't follow these very strict rules, then I'm a bad Christian, like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to. And in some ways it almost feels like opposite. Like that was the thing that was hard for me, is that in some ways it felt like some of the teachings were opposite of what we learned. Like we learned about like Jesus and loving people and accepting people, and then now you're telling me that we can't love these people or accept these people, and it's just like, wait, I'm
Yeah.
confused. So I find that sometimes, like, speaking to people who are more, I guess, I don't know if liberal is the right word, more open about those things, it, for me personally, that encompasses like my views of Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's very common. I think a lot of churches that get the most media and the most attention and that, are on TV and unfortunately a lot of times have the largest following are the ones that, just they preach love, but they don't necessarily live it. And so like it's hard for a lot of people, and this work is important for me to be in this space as a visibly queer person. I think it's life-saving work. I think um, theology has the power to harm, and it also has the power to liberate. And when people feel like they're at war with themselves, like it literally leads to death. And that's not something that I can do without, I mean, that to me is like the opposite of what I'm supposed to be doing on this earth. Um, but I think that for so many people, it's just death dealing. And so I think to just show that there's another way to read the Bible. You can respect the Bible and not harm people. Like that's possible. um, and so sort of just wanting to lead in that way.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me that people, I don't know, because I believe in sticking to the Bible and having your beliefs and stuff. But like you said, it's literally life saving just to accept people for who they are. Like they've shown like how much like suicide rates go down in teens just by having one adult who's like, it's okay for you to be you. And to me, I feel like I don't know how I can say that I'm a good Christian if me judging somebody could cause them harm when it doesn't impact my life any other way than to say like, I accept you for who you are, like love who you are, do you. But I mean, I can also, on the religious aspect of it, I do understand that there are parts of the Bibles that speak to being, against like homosexuality and things like that. So for you, like how, like what challenges have you faced as a queer ordained main and or a queer ordained minister, and how do you address them?
Yeah, actually, some people in one of the congregations that I work with are working through that exact thing right now. I'm really passionate about giving people tools. There are 6 passages in the Bible that people often quote um, to say that God does not accept homosexuality. And I think that each of those passages can be dealt with individually, but I think, like, to keep long story short, sort of the way that I approach those things is um, first of all, there's translation issues, right? Like the Bible was not written in English. There were decisions that were made about the types of words that we would translate into. Specifically with the New Testament, there were words in Greek that had multiple meanings that meant everything from pedophilia to any type of like coercive, like sexual relationship, words that are really quite ambiguous. And so at some point, like decisions were made about when we make this into English, what word are we going to pick, right? And it wasn't always homosexuality, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. So that's one, and I think there's also context to consider, right? Like in the Bible, there was not necessarily there were queer people, but there was not an understanding of sexual orientation as we understand it today as orientation, as an identity, as how you're born. That was not something that they could have even considered when the Bible was written. Typically, when it talks about specific behaviors, you have to look at well, what exactly was going on? Was this coercive? Was this an older person with a child? Like, there's a lot of things to kind of tease out where it's not just that it's same sex, it's that there's other power dynamics happening. And so there's just kind of a lot. But I think to summarize, like, none of those 6 passages in the Bible, Old Testament or New, are about sexual orientation as we understand it today. They've been translated incorrectly, or they have to do with other types of dynamics than just same sex. So that's typically how I deal with it.
Yeah, that's interesting to know. Something that drives me a little bit nuts is that I feel like sometimes we think that people, you operate from a sense of like what you know, right? Like the information that's available to you. And I feel like, you don't know what you don't know, but we live in a time right now where there's so much information available for you to learn and grow that it drives me insane that people make the choice not to further educate themselves. They're like, oh, I like this, I'm going to roll with this. And it's like, but you could learn a bit more and open yourself up to it. And people just make the choice not to. And it's not even just as far as things like sexuality. I mean, you're kind of like a double hitter because you also have social work in the mental health area. And we already know that's an area that is sometimes a struggle with religion, trying to get them to understand and be
Yeah.
accepting of mental health issues and how, to navigate those. And so you're kind of hitting it on both sides. And, how do you approach those conversations, whether it be about sexuality or mental health, with a community that traditionally holds, well, traditional values?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a couple different ways. I mean, I think um, getting people to understand that while there are very important things for us in the Bible, it was not meant to be a science book. It was not meant to be like a history book in the way that we expect it to be. Like, the truths that it teaches us is something else. It's not meant to help us understand like every single thing that we would uncover in history. And so mental health is sort of one of those things where it's alluded to in some ways, and different communities handle mental health challenges in different ways throughout history and different cultures. Um, but we have so much access now to like the science, to like neuroscience, to like how the brain works and like how it's impacted. And we shouldn't necessarily like see those things as a threat to the Bible. We just have to understand like the Bible is here to help us. And at the same time, like it comes to us from a different context. So if we're going to address mental health responsibly, we don't need just the Bible. We also need psychologists, we need social workers, we need psychiatrists, we need biology, we need chemistry. Like, we need more things to sort of wrap our arms around the human person, which is so complex. It's not just a spirit, not just a soul, but it's all these things. And so I try and just compare it to like the physical body. Like, you all, like, it all is impacting one another. Like, you can't separate your soul from your body, from your mental health. Like, it's all impacts each other. And if you broke your arm, you wouldn't say like, oh, let's just pray about it. Like, you would go to somebody who is specifically trained in that, and you trust them to like figure out what to do about it. And so I sort of talk about it in that way, and sort of help people trust that like God also works through like scientists and doctors, and so it just it takes time to see that uh there are things in life that take more than just praying, or prayer can have different forms, right? Like, you can say a prayer, you can also go to the doctor and that be a prayer. Like, you can take
Right.
a medication and that also be a prayer, like trusting that this is going to help heal you. And so, yeah, just kind of helping people expand their mind in that regard.
Yeah, it's a process, right? It's a constant process. And I have to imagine that besides just trying to find acceptance of others, sometimes the hardest thing is to find acceptance within yourself. So if you have a parishioner or a client on the social work side that's dealing with internalized homophobia or transphobia, and it's also causing a struggle in their faith, how do you help them? Like, how do you help to support them through that?
Yeah, well, I think it depends a lot on the person. I mean, um, some people really need a break from the church, from Christianity. And it's weird for people to hear a pastor say that, but I think that sometimes, like, I'm not one of those people who's like, it was people who hurt you, not God. Like, those things are hard to separate for people, right? Like, the way that we come to know God is through people. And so if all that you've ever known is destruction and harm and baggage, sometimes the healthiest thing for people is to find community elsewhere, um, and to figure out, like, is what I need like other versions of Christianity, or is what I need to actually leave? And I think for me, like, I want to be a person who my first priority is people's health and safety. And if that means leaving the church because there's too much baggage, you can't see past what's been done to you or what's been said to you, like, I will pastorally walk you out and help you find another community that is going to see you. But at the same time, I do know many churches that would accept and would help people, work through the Bible and experience God in ways that are more freeing. Um, but I know that sometimes not even that uh, can do it. So I think it just depends. But um, helping people understand that sometimes it's about first getting out of the toxic environment, um, being exposed to other types of community, and then, um, yeah, figuring out if it's just a different type of Christianity or a different community entirely.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice. That not one that you usually hear from a pastor, would just take a break. But I think that
Yeah.
sometimes you need that. You need that little to get over that trauma. It took me a while to realize I had some religious trauma based on mental health stuff and the ways that things were reacted to. And it's easy to sort of blame everybody for that and be like, I'm not into church. I'm not into any of this, when really it just maybe wasn't the right church for you or the right people for you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I believe God can be found in so many places. I don't think there's a place in the world, in the place in existence, where God cannot be found. So I am not, like, threatened by someone saying, like, the church is no longer a place that feels safe for me. Like, it makes me sad, but I also know that you can encounter God in so many ways. I do, right? And so it's not like you won't still be okay, or that that's not what's best for you. Like, I get that, and I want to help people just find a place where they can actually thrive.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. I think that level of openness makes it easier for people to come to you with things. Izzy had a great question. She said, before you became a minister, did you have a mentor or someone that you could go to for advice and encouragement?
Yeah, I have had a lot of different mentors throughout life. When I was This is kind of a queer stereotype, but but when I was younger, it was like, some of my teachers, like my art teachers, my English teachers, like stuff like that. Like, the teachers who were weird and who liked the weird kids, like those were mentors to me. People that, like, even mothered me in some ways. And then I think there were many people along the way who helped me in my faith, all the different forms that it took on. When I was a little conservative, I had a mentor. When I was trying to come out of that, I found new mentors. And of course, like, I was ordained in the Presbyterian Church, which is a very intensive ordination process. It's very long. But built into that, there's also a number of mentors as well to sort of help you navigate and ask questions. And so there's been a number of people, and then even now, that I go to when I really just need support or need help, personally, or just in this work that can be really, like, triggering and hard, and yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So, for you, what strategies do you use to sort of create an inclusive and affirming environment for LGBTQIA plus? Trying to make sure I got all the letters in there
All the
for
letters.
people within the community, just so that they feel that you are that safe space.
Yeah, well, I use myself as a resource, sharing my story, being out. That's a privilege that I have, that I get to be out. And so I try and use that to let other people know that I'm a place where they can go. Um, I think also, like, I do sometimes trainings around like how to like use the worship service to be a safe place for people, like in the terminology you use and in the language you use. Like inclusive language like is something that we're all learning about, but like what kind of like people, how do you address people, how do you um like things like pronouns, things like talking about different types of families, different types of lifestyles, like those are things that I try and like infuse into the service. And so like I don't want to add on like Black people, people of color, LGBTQ people in as an afterthought. Like they are regularly named in service, both for like the difficulties that they experience and also the wonderful things that they've done and contributed to. And so like it is my goal to like work inclusion into every single part of the service. I want there to be queer people next to me, like leading services with me. I want there to be inclusive language. I want there to be sermons that are from the perspective of queer people, people of color, all types of communities, so that it doesn't feel like somebody comes in and they're like, does this actually relate to my life? Like I try and give many examples from many different types of people's lives. Um, and I think also just having educational resources available, having books around, having, you know, mental health numbers around so that people can connect, and know that you support their health, their flourishing. Um, and so those are a couple of the things that come to mind. I put flags everywhere. um, I know that people sometimes drive around looking for flags, and that's how they decide where to go to church because they don't want to try and have to guess. So I put those types of symbols and colors all around. So those are a couple of things that I do.
And I love that you're able to be like just out and be that beacon for others. I think that something that makes me sad lately is I feel like as much as we've grown in our tolerance, there's also been a lot of pushback more than normal. Like there's a lot, the intolerance is growing
Yeah.
in an almost scary way. And so Izzy actually had a question also earlier, which is with all that's going on in the world, what and how do you continue to move in courage? Because I mean, I totally get that question because I could see wanting to hide that flag because there are more instances of violence and things like that. So where do you find the courage to do that and to just continue to be out?
Yeah, whew, it's hard. Like it's real hard. And I'm the first one to say that. Like I'm out and queer. I'm Black. I'm a woman. Like I'm young. Like I'm a small person. Like I feel like there are many opportunities for like there to be harm done to me, or for people to like take advantage of me or think that they can. And so like it's risky every single day. Like you
Yeah.
put something out, it's risky. And so I mean I'm in therapy. Like I've been in therapy most of my life, like building up courage, building up like my sense of purpose. Like even if I were to put myself in harm's way, like why do I do this? Like I have to always stay connected to the why and the purpose. And then I'm not stupid. Like I make sure that I'm not alone. Like I make sure that like things are locked up. Like I just those are things that I take very seriously because I know that I'm in an outward position that could be targeted. So I also like, try and keep myself secure and try and make sure somebody always knows where I am. Um, and we have to be smart with how we move in the neighborhood and how we move throughout Delaware, even like places we can go, places where we need to say things a different way. Um, so I try and just use wisdom and at the same time stay connected to people who are really gonna like call me back to why do I do this? Because it's hard and it's really scary. Like it's increasingly scary.
Yeah.
One of the churches I am at, like we've had a lot of things happen. um, and we've had like flags torn down and all kinds of stuff. Um, and there's strength in numbers. Like we get together and we just put them back up and people send us more flags, so
Yeah.
it just takes community too.
Yeah. And Charles said it's an evil world out there at times. And I couldn't agree. I think the thing that gets me the most is that, like, when all of that comes from fellow religious people, right? Like, to me, the people who should be the most loving and the most whatever, like, my brain cannot reconcile doing harm to others and thinking that that's a good thing. Like, thinking, like, this is the way. And I mean, I get it. It's human nature. All throughout history, some of the biggest atrocities have been done in the name of religion. But it just, yeah, it like grinds me up because I'm like, I don't understand how. Like, I sometimes am like, were we reading two different Bibles here? Like, did we
Right.
interpret everything completely different? What's going on?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have to stay prayed up. You have to go back into your lineage and figure out how your ancestors like protected themselves. Cause like that stuff is real. Like it is spiritually, physically, emotionally violent out there. But you have to stay strong because there's so few of us and there's so many people who do need to know that we exist. And so I think for me, coming back to the point of like this is life-saving work keeps me taking it very seriously. Like I have to do this, like otherwise like I am complicit like in an institution that has done so much damage.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, you also, you mentioned going to therapy a bit, which I think is great. It's always interesting to me when people say, like, oh, do you want a therapist who goes to therapy? Yes, because your doctor goes to the doctor. Like, people go, it's good, to have that. How do you balance your professional responsibilities with self-care and maintenance to your own mental health?
Yeah, I mean, therapy is one of them, always having that space carved out. Um, I think also taking breaks. There's things that I do each day. There's things that I do each week. Like I take a day off every week. I try and take, time off as often as I can. And that is also a privilege that not everybody has. And because I have that privilege, I try and use it up. Um, the time I get to take off and I don't have to think about work and I get to just be a human being and I get to just be restored. Um, and then, like I said, I take a day off each week. Otherwise, I'd work every day of the week um, because that's just the nature of this work. But I make myself take a day where I'm unplugged, not from like personal stuff, but just from anything to do with work. Um, and then I just have people who hold me accountable. I have my closest friends, I have my work friends, like the work friends where you can also be your full self around. And then I have a spiritual director, which is not exactly a therapist, but more of like a spiritual support, um, and somebody who's making sure that like I'm not, you know, acting out of woundedness, that I'm like not acting out of my triggers, that I'm like always working on like how I'm healing my own stuff as I'm hearing other people's. So I think that those are like some of my main things. And then just the everyday taking care of yourself things. It's hard, stuff I don't want to do, but I know that like if I'm dehydrated, for example, like I can't be helpful to anybody.
Right, right. Yeah,
So like stuff like that.
yeah, I think we all have those lists. Like, we all know the things that we should do, and I don't know why it's always often things you don't want to do, even though you know that that's what will make you feel better. Um, it's like that's the battle. For me, that's the hardest battle, is the things that you don't want to do that you should do because you know in the long run they'll be better.
Exactly. It's a
Um,
necessary part of growing up.
Adulting, yes.
Yes.
Izzy said, "What a beautiful soul you are. Your calling will help so many that don't have the courage." Yes, and I absolutely agree.
Hmm.
We talked a little bit about some of the mental health struggles and how, they can sort of reconcile that with themselves, um, with religion. But like, what role does the community play in fostering that mental health and spirituality well-being? And like, what things can we do just as average neighbors and friends to help affirm them?
Yeah, definitely. I think, having studied mental health, like this is one of the things that I don't always feel like we talk about really well, like because it's part of the larger like healthcare system. Like a lot of things end up being very individualistic, and we like lose the aspect of like community care and all that goes into that. And so I think like for me, a part of like taking back mental health from the machine and systems of oppression is really emphasizing like the role that the community really does play and like our healing. And so I think for people to be in communities where they can be their true authentic self, not that they're all perfect, that they don't mess up, but that we are in places where people know us well enough to like notice when we're not doing well. Uh, they know us well enough to know that if they mess up, they know how to repair. Um, People who like advocate for you, like not just on a like personal level, but also like relationally, also like politically, have your well-being at heart, um, that care about like not just you as an individual, but like just conditions in the world, who are actively working towards that. Um, and then I think making sure that people have a life where they can rest. Like I talk about rest all the time, but I think you can't really rest without a community. Like I don't have kids, but I think a lot about like parents who it's like, when are they going to rest, right? Like they need community. They need somebody to like take those kids,
Right.
right? Like that's a part of mental health care. Like we need to have people in our life, and if we are in people's lives who have kids, like we need to take off the load sometimes, so that way people can rest, people could go away, people can take an evening to themselves. Like we all need to like figure out where the gaps are, and help to fill those in so that people can actually do the self-care that we're saying that they need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say, like, I do not know how parents do it. I
Yeah.
know how kids don't want kids, and I'm just like, because I just can't imagine like having like a rough day or work or like dealing with all this stuff, and then you go home and there's other people to take care of. Like, oh
Right, like, you have to feed people? Like, that's
take
wild.
care of them. Like, I'm like, oh no. I
Yeah,
try to be part of the community. I'm like, I can watch the kids, but there's a 3 hour limit. Like, I'm not a parent for a reason.
yeah, I mean, like, I also just I can't imagine, but I feel like that's one of those things where it's like, you need community. Like, nobody was ever meant to raise kids, have a job, have a household by themselves. Like, that's just not how we were created.
Yeah.
And so part of it is like, where can I ask for help? Where are the gaps where I need more support? And then how can you like know people well enough to do those things?
And I think that is huge because I know for me, like, I'm terrible about asking for help just because, like, I love giving help to others. And I know that I don't mind helping others. So I don't know why I think people mind helping me.
Yeah,
But for some reason, I just do not want to ask for help. And so there really are times where people thankfully know me well enough to be like, hey. And I think that that's what you said is so important, is knowing the people around you so that you can see when they're off or when they might need a little bit of guidance, even if they're not in a place to ask for it themselves.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Cause people are different too. Like it takes knowing people well enough. Cause some people, when they're really stressed out, they don't get out of bed. And some people, when they're really stressed out, they overwork. So
Mhm.
like, so
Yeah,
like you gotta know, like, okay, this is a bad sign,
right.
right? Like,
Absolutely. And something that you mentioned earlier, as far as like giving people the resources, I think is really important. And so I'd like to sort of end just talking about that a little bit. Like if you have any like resources of suggestions that you would give to people if it's something that they're struggling with, whether it's with their sexuality or finding that religion aspect of it, what are some places or tools people can use?
Yeah, I think if it's specific to like just queerness and religion, there's always books that I recommend. Trying to think now. Queer Virtue is one. Queer Theology is another. There's a book called Our Lives Matter. Um, there are some podcasts. There are, well, I have a podcast, but mine is Divine Audacity, which you can find anywhere you get podcasts. Um, if folks are really interested in just the Bible itself, there's a podcast called um, The Bible Tells Me So. Um, there's one called The Bible for Normal People, which is really just people who are not trained in the Bible. It's a weird name, but yeah, there are some Christian resources. There's one called Enfleshed. There's one called Sanctified Art. They're really helpful for pastors, but also just people who want to know about like how prayer and what spirituality looks like uh, in ways that are affirming. So they're going to use language that's more expansive, more inclusive. Um, and then there was something else. Oh, Black Liturgies also is a page that you can follow on Instagram, but there's also a book that I think is just absolutely wonderful. It talks about faith from the perspective of a Black woman, but also who is queer identifying as well. And a lot of her prayers and poems and reflections are from that lens, and I think are really healing.
Thank you. Those sound like a lot of good options. So hopefully anyone watching this will check them out. Thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Your wealth of knowledge. If anyone is watching this and sort of either in a curious space or a dark space, like is there anything you would tell them? Any last words of upliftment or encouragement?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just tell people like wherever you're at is valid. We live in a world that is very violent and very full of hatred, and so if you're feeling down, it makes sense. Um, and you're not alone. Like there's folks out here who have been there. Um, and ultimately like there's nothing wrong with you. Like there is a way through. There are people who have been through it, who have made it through, who are making it through. Like there are ways to heal. Like I said, whether it's finding a new community, whether it's leaving the community you're in, it's hard out here, but like there are people who like care a lot, and it's not you. It's nothing to do with you. It's entirely these systems that harm all of us, and we end up hurting each other. So um yeah, just there is a different way out there. Another world is possible.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for your time, Reverend Brooks. It was wonderful speaking with you and sharing a little bit about you with everybody. Where can they find you if they want to connect?
Yeah, I'm very loud on Instagram, so you can follow me on Instagram. Let me find my name again. Brooke underscore Alexandria 630. You can also follow me on Facebook, Brooke A. Scott. And if you're interested in church, you can search Church on Main. If you're local, come visit. If you're not local, there's online services as well. But yeah, those are some quick ways to connect with me and some of the work that I'm doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody who joined us. Please come back again next week. I'll be with Francisca Marino, and she is the creator of the Delaware Fat Collective. So we're going to be talking about queerness and then also living in plus size bodies and what's that navigating those waters. So please come back next week, Thursday at 6 p.m. and have a great day.
I love it.